From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Just 1 month ago, some political insiders were beginning to lay bets on Reform UK winning the next election, as they overtook all the other parties in the polls.
Let me take you through the latest YouGov Sky News exclusive poll, because what it does, Sophie, is it puts Reform UK in the lead. Reform UK in the latest voting intention poll are on 25%, overtaking Labour, who were top, who are on 24%. The Tories down in third on 21%.
But now, the party they pose the greatest threat to is their own.
What is going on? Reform really can't think that they have done themselves any good releasing this story.
Well, it never helps when you've got division, does it?
No.
Reform UK is in turmoil, and all because of one MP, Rupert Lowe.
When we met him, he was canvassing at the races, at the horse races at Great Yarmouth Racecourse, and he hadn't arranged to go there kind of in advance, and he managed to talk his way in on the gate. And, you know, that is the kind of man he is. He's clearly got the gift of the gab and was an effective campaigner. He clearly knew the patch that he was canvassing. He knew how to talk to people in Great Yarmouth, and he is not afraid to get into an argument, to get into a scrap.
It's slightly odd to make the judgment before you've got the facts, which appears to be what they've done here. They've then pursued a particularly malign course of action to try and blacken my name. So I think the first thing I want to do is burn all those bushes and get that all out of the way, because it's complete rubbish.
How did Reform go from being an unstoppable force on the political landscape to a party riven by infighting? The story today, the civil war that could tear down Reform.
I'm Geri Scott, and I'm the senior political correspondent for The Times.
Geri, you've been following Reform ever since the party was set up. Were you surprised by this spat?
No. Because this is kind of always the way that these things tend to go. And this is a party which thrives on people speaking their mind, actually, and being outspoken. So no, it's not a surprise. But I think the surprise is maybe how soon this has come since Reform's success at the election. You know, we've all pored over countless analysis pieces about how well they did, how they've been surging in the polls. And I think the surprise really is that it's fallen apart this quickly, but it just shows, you know, that there have been tensions kind of in the background for a while.
We'll get into Rupert Lowe in some detail in a bit, but before we do, just give us the business card description. Who is he?
Yeah, so he is the MP for Great Yarmouth, and he was one of the kind of big Reform triumphs of the night on election night. But his background is very, very interesting. So he has been kind of around this political sphere for a while. He's very, very wealthy. He has been donating his MP salary to local charities every month, which has earned him kind of a lot of kudos in the local community. But he is this kind of fascinating figure because, you know, I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail, but he has some policy positions which are quite significantly to the right of Nigel Farage. So where he has sat within Reform has been quite interesting to watch in these last few months.
Well, we will come on to that in a moment. But before we do, take us back to last Wednesday when an interview that was being published in the Daily Mail on Thursday morning was sort of first went online and people had a chance to look at it. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, yes, Rupert Lowe had done this interview with the Daily Mail where he had essentially said that under Nigel Farage, Reform remained a party of protest, and he called Nigel a messiah, basically. And what he was essentially saying is that the party couldn't continue to just operate as it had been under the governance structure that it had been.
And when he called him a messiah, this wasn't in a good way. This is more in a Monty Python way.
No, absolutely not.
This is he thinks he's a messiah.
Exactly. And Why this is fascinating is I think a lot of people in the next few days, as we see this fallout, are going to be pointing to that as the kind of straw that broke the camel's back. And I think that's correct. But actually, there have been tensions between the two men far before this.
Well, we will come on to some of those underlying tensions in a bit. But before we do, on this interview, what was Nigel Farage's reaction when he read it?
Yeah, he wasn't best pleased.
We are not a protest party in any way at all. That is utterly wrong. Utterly, completely wrong. We are an entirely positive party.
And he basically offered up an interview where he said he didn't know why Rupert Lowe was saying these things.
Why is Rupert Lowe going public with these comments? There's not something better to be had behind closed doors?
Well, perhaps he wants to be Prime Minister. Most people in politics do.
He suggested maybe he wants to be Prime Minister. He said most politicians do.
Well, look, do you know what? If I've got a following out there, that's a good thing. If I hadn't, we wouldn't have won any seats in Parliament at all on the 4th of July.
Including Great Yarmouth, I presume you put in that.
There wouldn't have been a cat's chance in hell, would there? Come on, be honest about it.
And he also basically said that Rupert Lowe would not have had a cat's chance in hell of winning in Great Yarmouth if it had not been for Farage coming back into the political fray. And I think you can't deny, actually, that Farage coming back to frontline politics put rocket boosters up reform. I think you can't deny that Rupert Lowe did ride on the coattails of that. But what has happened since, kind of in establishing his own kind of cult of personality, has been really, really interesting to watch, because I think there has been a divergence between the two men.
It didn't stop there, did it? It didn't stop at Nigel Farage's interview talking about how important he'd been to Reform's chances, because the party itself, the high-ups, made their own move on Thursday morning. Tell us what happened.
Reform reported Rupert Lowe to the police, which is such an interesting move, right, to report one of your own MPs to the police. And this is allegedly about threats of violence that they say Rupert Lowe made against Siegel, who is the chair of the party. And this came off the back of alleged incident that happened in December. But the timing here is fascinating because it was only reported the day after that Daily Mail interview.
Months later,
allegedly this happened in December, not reported to the police until last week.
And what do we know about the actual allegations?
So not much, actually, is the honest answer. We don't know that much, apart from what the Reform say happened is that he made violent threats against the chairman. They weren't carried out. There was no physical violence, but it was threats. And the police say that they're looking into it, investigating, seeing if there is any kind of credible claim to be made there. We then were told there were also allegations of bullying against staff in his office.
What does Rupert Lowe say about what happened?
Rupert Lowe says it's not true. He has strenuously denied the claims. There have been denials about the staff members that he is alleged to have bullied, saying that didn't happen at all. And the other thing that Rupert Lowe has said is that actually that he's been in discussion with his legal team. He says this will be followed by legal action in due course. And he is very, very strident. He says, I will not have my name dragged through the mud as part of a political assassination because I dared to question Nigel Farage. So I think it's very clear that Rupert Lowe is strenuously denying all this and is going to fight it until the end.
Rupert Lowe denies not only having threatened violence against the chairman of Reform, but also the accusation of bullying against two separate female members of staff. What has Rupert Lowe said about Reform going to the police?
He says it's a vindictive witch hunt. That is what he has called it. Says that it is all linked to his criticism of Farage. What we've heard from the party, what Richard Tice, deputy leader, has been saying is that, there have been a lot of problems behind the scenes for a while.
It does feel a bit fishy, doesn't it? That actually, the moment he clashes with Nigel Farage, suddenly he's disciplined. Your party has made a big deal of your being defenders of free speech. This all feels a bit Putin-esque, doesn't it?
Far from it, and that's completely inappropriate. The reality is, behind the scenes, there had been a number of difficulties and challenges, and you get to the point where you say enough's enough, and particularly when you get these allegations of bullying by female staff, and you then get to the point where you've got to launch an investigation.
But Rupert Lowe clearly thinks that this is kind of a calculated attack on him. What those who are still supportive of him, his allies, say is that Farage was threatened by his popularity. And he does have a distinct following of his own. We've seen just in the last few days, there are Reform members who are posting online saying, I stand with Rupert Lowe, this is a stitch up,
Wow.
those kind of things. So he definitely does have a following of his own. And the argument is that Nigel Farage potentially feels threatened by that. Now, of course, Reform deny that that's the case. They say it's nothing to do with that. But, there is a track record of people who interact with Nigel Farage eventually being put out into the cold. But what we are now kind of in the middle of is essentially a giant slagging match between Reform and one of its former MPs, accusing each other of lying, threatening legal action against each other. And it's really, really messy.
And in Rupert Lowe, a character who has had a bigger profile, has now been booted out for now. He's called it a coordinated hit job to force him out of Reform. He's had the whip removed, which leaves Reform a smaller parliamentary party.
Yeah, it goes from 5 MPs to 4, right? And you could already argue that they were punching above their weight in terms of the kind of coverage they get, the cut through. I think that the character and the kind of following that Rupert Lowe has built individually has had a lot to play in this. I'm from Great Yarmouth. I'm from his constituency. So I see a lot of this kind of in acquaintances in my personal life that I might see on social media. He has made a big impact in the town. There has definitely been a kind of step change in the politics. And I went there during the election and did an on-the-ground piece, and people were very, very supportive of him. What will be interesting now is to see whether they are supportive of him or whether they are supportive of Reform.
Geri, you mentioned that you're from Great Yarmouth. You've sort of seen the man in action. Tell us a bit more about him. Who is he? What's his background?
Yeah, so he's 67. He made his fortune running care homes, and he's quite a fascinating character, right? He's a farmer. He's tapped into that with the recent inheritance tax troubles that Labour have found themselves involved in. He's a former chairman of Southampton Football Club, and he has been kind of present in politics in recent years. This isn't his first rodeo. He stood in the Kingswood by-election in 2024 as the Reform candidate. He got 10.4% of the vote. It was the party's best result at that point. But even before that, he won a seat for the Brexit Party as an MEP in 2019. So he has been around, which also means that he has known Nigel Farage and the people around his party infrastructure for a long time, right? This isn't just a kind of guy who has come up from nowhere and suddenly appeared. They do know each other. They do have a history. But yeah, he came back. He was Reform's business and agriculture spokesman before winning last year's election in Great Yarmouth. And it's, as I alluded to earlier, it was quite the coup for Reform, because really, Great Yarmouth, it had been a Tory seat for many, many years. And it really should have been a win for Labour, and the fact that Reform won it was a big coup for them. But if you're from the area like I am, or you spent any time in the area, it was actually quite obvious that was going to happen.
Well, tell me about that. For people who haven't been, what is Great Yarmouth like, and why was it so obvious to you that Reform were going to win there?
Great Yarmouth is a town which has been let down by multiple governments of all colours, right? There is very little opportunity in the town. It had a brilliant tourism industry in the 50s, which doesn't exist anymore. The kind of introduction of cheap package holidays abroad kind of killed that off for Great Yarmouth. It had oil boom in the 80s, and people had money and jobs, but that's obviously gone as well. And there have been multiple kind of attempts to reinvent the town, which just haven't worked. It's kind of stereotypical of a place where the shops on the high street have closed, there aren't any jobs, there aren't many opportunities. There are many people who live on benefits. It has problems with drugs and antisocial behaviour. It's a place where there are high levels of immigration, which mean that there's actually quite a lot of division in the town. A lot of asylum hotels are based there. And, it's not frankly, it's not a very nice place to live. And I get offended when other people say that about my hometown. But as someone who is from there, it isn't a very nice place to live. And the people who live in Great Yarmouth are good people. They are salt of the earth people, and they, want what's best for them and their families. But it is a town that has been consistently let down through a lack of investment and a lack of opportunities. It hasn't been able to reinvent itself in a way that you might say, like some seaside towns in Kent have maybe been able to do, for example, which is a big shame. So what that all means is that the town was ripe for a candidate for reform to win because people feel let down. Life had not got better for decades for people in Great Yarmouth. So of course they were going to vote for something different. When I was there during the election, people told me, I'm just fed up. I'm just fed up of being lied to. Yeah. And that is a big part of the reason that Great Yarmouth voted reform, because why would they trust anyone else?
So you can understand the frustration at successive governments, both Conservative and Labour, who have really let the place down. And yet, in some ways, it would seem surprising that a place that feels like it's been, left economically deprived, it hasn't had the opportunities that other bits of the country have, that it should sort of embrace a multi-millionaire in the same way. I mean, tell us a bit about his politics and what he stands for and why he became a figure they could all get behind.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Rupert Lowe is he is a multi-millionaire, but he speaks the language that a lot of people in the town will speak. This is one of the areas that he has diverged from Nigel Farage on when he's been calling for mass deportations of immigrants in this country. That is a message that will play very well in Great Yarmouth because wrongly, many people in the town blame a lot of its woes on immigration, and they will say that there are parts of the town that you can no longer go to. They will call them no-go areas because of asylum seekers being housed in hotels. Now, look, I'm not saying that that's the correct view to have at all, but I'm saying that is what people on the ground will tell you. He also got very heavily involved in the grooming gang scandal, right? And was, very, very outspoken on that and calling for the kind of highest levels of punishment. And essentially, he is tapping into a lot of the messages that people see on social media, that they see online, that they identify with. And whether that can be a long-term strategy, I don't know, because eventually you have to deliver on those things that you promise. But you can see why, finally, these voters felt like someone was talking about the things they cared about. And that's why he has been so successful.
So he is publicly more to the right than Nigel Farage. That's clearly very popular in Great Yarmouth. Is it popular with reform voters across the country?
Yes and no. So I think what we've seen from Reform as a party over the last couple of years is an attempt to professionalise. And what that has meant is distancing the party from more extreme figures that might have been associated with it in the past. And you see this with, Farage has a rule that people who have been associated with the BNP, for example, or the English Defence League, they're not allowed to be associated with Reform. Take Tommy Robinson, for example. Farage doesn't ever want to really get into a discussion about Tommy Robinson because he sees him, quite rightly, as toxic. Rupert Lowe seems to be happy to operate in those spaces a little bit more. He will entertain the conversations and he will stray into those messages, that kind of online space that we see of the more far right, maybe. Whereas Reform has really tried to become a more mainstream party because that is where votes lie. So I think you can definitely see a split in the last few days of the kind of more moderate Reform voters, let's call them, and maybe the more extreme Reform voters coming down on a side of either Farage or Rupert Lowe. And I think you can see that split along kind of ideological lines. I think that much is clear.
So he's created almost a schism in the party. He represents ideas which are even to the right of Nigel Farage. But that's not the only reason we think Nigel Farage has felt threatened by him. To understand where this row probably really begins, I suppose we ought to go back to January and a pretty extraordinary transatlantic spat on X. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is when, remarkably, Reform and Nigel Farage have been courting Elon Musk for quite a while. for a donation. There had been kind of reports in the Times and the Sunday Times about him potentially donating, large sums to the party to help them campaign, to get off the ground. And in fact, Farage and Nick Candy, the treasurer, went over to meet Elon Musk. There was a photo of them. They posed in front of a portrait of Donald Trump. And that was kind of taken as being Elon Musk's kind of support, really, for the party. And we all thought that donation was going to come in. But what changed was that Musk suddenly seemed to throw his support behind Rupert Lowe. It was kind of an extraordinary turnaround in that he suggested that maybe Farage isn't the person to lead reform and that actually Rupert Lowe might be a better choice. And that was quite extraordinary, really. All the work that Farage had done to build that relationship seemed to have gone out of the window. And essentially, what Musk said is that Farage might not have what it takes to lead the party. And he basically, suggested that he was seeing a lot of things that Rupert Lowe said and he liked them. And you would imagine, if you are Nigel Farage and you've put all this work in, that you would be enraged by that. I can't imagine it went down well.
And instead, Elon Musk favours a man he hasn't even met. He's just seen his posts on X.
Yeah.
How did Rupert Lowe respond to it at the time?
Yeah, well, look, he said Nigel is the leader of reform and that he supported him. He didn't lean into it. But, I think we have seen him become emboldened by it. What is interesting here is that actually Reform are almost trying to use that against Rupert Lowe a bit. They're saying that he's been captured by the online right, that he's spending too much time posting on X and those kind of things. So they are trying to use it against him a little bit. But I think it's very clear that the engagement that he's getting on his posts has driven a lot of this kind of angst within the party.
And that's not the only sign that Rupert Lowe may have ambitions for a little more power. Tell us about some of the interviews he's been giving.
Yeah, so he has done quite an interesting kind of set of interviews. He spoke to The Spectator in Australia last month and he said, he's definitely willing to be Prime Minister. And you might raise an eyebrow at that, but actually a lot of MPs you'd speak to actually secretly think that they could really do the job if given half a chance, that they could do the job much better than whoever.
He's not alone.
He's not alone.
Would I do it if I had to? Well, look, I love the country, and if I had to do it, I think I would definitely do it. But we've got Nigel Farage, who's our leader, and at the end of the day, we're now leading the polls. He's favourite to be Prime Minister. I'm still pretty long odds. But who knows? If circumstances demanded it, would I enjoy doing a bit of Quango bashing? You bet I would.
You can see how that would cause a strain on their relationship, particularly at a time, about a month ago, when it did look like they might win the next election. They were leading in the polls. They had a lot of momentum behind them.
Yeah.
As he says, none of those MPs would probably have seats if he hadn't come back to lead the party. And yet, every party he does lead does tend to have a lot of these big clashes.
Yeah. And we saw this in the run-up to the election as well, as there was story after story about candidates who had said this or done that, or there was some scandal. They're not squeaky clean, but they also don't want to be. They believe that this shows that they're real people and that actually voters can identify with some of the mistakes that they have made as well. But I do think Farage can be a blessing and a curse. I think he is right to say these people would not have got their seats had he not come back. Look at the numbers in the polls, right? And he does have that almost celebrity factor about him when he turns up at rallies and they cheer for him and he is almost like a superstar within their ranks. I think, the problem for Farage is that you have to have that infrastructure around you and you have to have that support around you, but you also have to be semi-comfortable with people also developing their own fan base. You have to be comfortable to not be maybe as threatened as he does sometimes feel when that success plays itself out, because the kind of natural conclusion of being a successful political party is you are going to have people coming up around you who also have their own following.
And Geri, it does seem remarkable. They always say a week is a long time in politics, but, just a month ago, Reform was doing so well in the polls. A lot of people were putting money on them winning the next election. Their closeness to Donald Trump seemed like a real asset. Is that still the case?
I think it remains to be seen. I think their connection to Donald Trump is less the problem more actually is their position on Putin and what we're seeing in Ukraine. Because, in this country, the polls show time and time again that voters of all types are really committed to supporting Zelensky, supporting Ukraine, and are really obviously negative towards Putin and Russia. Now, that is the kind of place that the traditional parties, the Conservatives and Labour, think that they can attack reform. They think that there is a massive, massive problem there with them not wanting to call out Vladimir Putin in the same way that other parties will do, and that's where they will attack them. That and the NHS, they believe that Farage's comments on the NHS and potentially having private elements of it are toxic. So actually, for me, the question isn't whether all these rows and falling outs and things like that are going to do it for reform. I don't think that's a problem. I think actually parties that Nigel Farage are involved in thrive on these kind of disagreements. It is how they work. But actually, it's the policy positions that Reform is taking, which is going to be problematic for them. That is where people like Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch will attack Reform. It won't be about these kind of internal rows. It will be about those policy positions in the end. But of course, the fact that this is happening, that Rupert Lowe has gone over the top, that they're now down to 4 MPs, I'm sure that will be used politically to attack them. But will it be the thing that does for them in the end? I'm not convinced.
That was Geri Scott, Senior Political Correspondent for The Times. You can read more of Geri's work, including the latest in the reform row, at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Sam Chantarasak and Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll help others to find us. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.